Good evening. I'm Ronald Crutcher, President of the University of Richmond, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the virtual kickoff of our 2020-2021 Sharp Viewpoint Speaker Series. While I regret that public health conditions prevent us from gathering in person, I am so pleased that our virtual format allows us to reach viewers well beyond the boundaries of our campus. The Sharp Series was established in 2011 in honor of Richard L. Sharp, a nationally recognized entrepreneur, to present competing views on topics crucial to our nation and our world. Sharp was a recognized thought leader and an exemplar of personal and professional integrity who served as a mentor to aspiring business and community leaders. Among his many professional roles, Mr. Sharp served as chairman of the board at Circuit City, CarMax, and Crocs Incorporated. Mr. Sharp was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's disease in late 2010, but continued to demonstrate his values of leading by example and making the world a better place until his death in 2014. The university celebrates its commitment to Mr. Sharp's vision by fostering important dialogues that challenge us to think critically about the many pressing issues of our time. This year, we welcome pairs of thought leaders with opposing views to model thoughtful and substantive dialogue across political and ideological divides. We do not do so to suggest that there must always be compromise. Rather, in a bitterly polarized time when any discussion around race, religion, or politics teeters on the edge of diatribe, it is critically important to provide young people with role models who can openly and energetically disagree, devoid of acrimony. Universities can and must serve as laboratories of democracy, crucibles for learning how to live and participate actively in a democratic society. To succeed, we must be intentional about graduating students skilled at engaging with a variety of opinions and perspectives. We are fortunate to have a robust lineup of speakers this year who can help prepare our students for the challenges that lie ahead and give them information they can take into the classroom, living room, or workplace. Now, in just a moment, I will welcome my colleague, Dr. Sandra Peart, Dean of the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, to introduce tonight's thought leaders and moderate a discussion about bipartisanship in this most polarized and contentious era. Dean Peart is a leading scholar and educator in the field of economics and has authored or edited 10 books and more than 100 articles in the areas of constitutional political economy, leadership in experimental settings, ethics in higher education, and the transition to modern economic thought. Thank you, Sandra, for leading tonight's important discussion. Following the conversation with our guests, Dean Peart will facilitate a question and answer session, drawing on questions our students asked our speakers earlier today in a virtual dialogue session. I encourage you to engage with us too by using the #URSharp hashtag on social media. Thank you once again for joining us tonight. Now, I'd like to welcome Dean Sandra Peart.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm so very pleased to introduce tonight's leaders, Denis McDonough and Mike Sommers. Denis McDonough is currently Senior Advisor at the Markle Foundation. From February 2013 to January 2017, Mr. McDonough served as White House Chief of Staff to President Barack Obama. Prior to his tenure in the White House, he served in senior leadership and policymaking positions in the U.S. House of Representatives as professional staff member on the International Relations Committee and in the U.S. Senate for the Senate Majority Leader and for Senator Ken Salazar. McDonough received his BA, summa cum laude, from St. John's University and his master's degree from Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. He lives in Maryland with his wife and 3 children. Mr. McDonough is joined this evening by Mike Sommers, the 15th President and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute, the largest national trade association representing all aspects of America's national gas and oil industry. Previously, Mr. Sommers led the American Investment Council, representing the nation's leading private equity and growth capital firms and other business partners. Throughout his career, Mr. Sommers has held leadership roles in the U.S. House of Representatives and at the White House, including as Chief of Staff for Speaker of the House John A. Boehner and Special Assistant to President George W. Bush at the National Economic Council. Sommers is a native of Naperville, Illinois, and a graduate of Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. Mike, his wife, and 3 children live in Alexandria, Virginia. Welcome to the University of Richmond, Denis and Mike. Please join me. Welcome again.
Thanks, Sandra.
Great to be with you.
Great. I wonder, Denis and Mike, if you could begin our conversation this evening by speaking about an instance in which you successfully worked to build bipartisan relationships and have a bipartisan success. Perhaps you can give us some examples from your work as a staffer. We'll start with Mike.
Great. Thank you, Sandra. Great to be with you. And I want to thank all the students and the broader University of Richmond community. Dr. Crutcher and I have been friends for many, many years, and I want to thank him for the kind invitation to this beautiful campus. So it's great to be with you. The subject of bipartisanship is so very important in our government today. In a divided era, we always need to find time to figure out a way to find common ground among the political parties. And I say common ground because this isn't necessarily compromise. There are places where both parties, I think, can come together on big issues facing our country. One example that I experienced in my nearly 20 years in government was at a really critical time in our country's history. This was a period in 2008 when this country faced one of the worst financial crises that this country has ever seen, where the world economic structure was really melting down. Right before the presidential election in 2008, the Congress was briefed by Ben Bernanke, then Federal Reserve Chairman, on really what could happen if we didn't act quickly. The bipartisan leadership at that point was able to come together and figure out a way to inject needed capital into the economy to stabilize the world economy at that time. That was a time, of course, that was very partisan. We're talking about October of an election year, where Senator John McCain was up against Senator Barack Obama. But somehow, even in that very partisan environment, we were able to come together and do what was right for the American people. It took a lot of time, though. As you'll recall, that first vote in the House of Representatives actually failed. And we had to put Humpty Dumpty back together again at that time. And ultimately, a week later, we were able to come together on a bipartisan basis. And again, that was a time of really incredible partisanship, of course, but in a time of national crisis, we were able to come together. I'm very proud of that moment, of course, and I think it could provide a basis for future bipartisan agreement going forward.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Denis.
Sandra, thanks so much. It's great to be here. Thank you for the opportunity. Dr. Crutcher, thanks for the invitation to the students and to the greater community. Thanks for hosting us. It's good to be here with Mike. I think it's useful to take a quick step back and recognize that the founders, by creating a constitutional system with overlapping powers, did, as one scholar said, set up a system that invites leaders to struggle between branches, between the executive and the legislature and the judiciary, and then within those branches. And it's because the fact is that out of debate and discussion, ideas get better. And so the times that I've seen, as Mike is saying, where bipartisan agreement was hatched, it was out of this belief that somehow members of Congress, members of an administration are actually listening to one another. And TARP sounds like one of those examples. I witnessed many of those examples in the days and weeks after 9/11 in 2001. And then just one thing that Mike and I worked together is a budget agreement in 2014. at the height of wrangling between the two branches on funding the government, we were able to take a step back and come up with competing and cooperative arrangements for funding the government over the course of that year. So when leaders listen to one another, they draw on the expertise of their teams, and they recognize that we have a constitutional obligation to come to some arrangement. We can and do often come to some bipartisan agreements.
So both of you, this is a follow-up question. Both of you mentioned crises. There can be no worse crisis than 9/11, perhaps, or than TARP, the economic world falling apart. Is that what it takes then to get a bipartisan agreement? Does it take a crisis, or can you speak as well about bipartisanship in times when perhaps we're not quite so challenged?
Well, what I'd say, Sandra, is it does seem like we manage as a government from crisis to crisis on these big issues. But I do think 90% of what our government does is done on a bipartisan basis. It just doesn't get a lot of the headlines that is the preferred form of news for the American people, it seems like these days. And I do think that media and the way it is developed over time is really leading to this division. The reason why we have divided government is because the people are divided. And I think part of that is the choose your own news approach that has developed over the last 20 years with social media. What I'd say is there are a lot of things that are happening, positive things within our government that are being done at a bipartisan level. They just don't get that kind of attention. One example that I'd use is this year, we passed one of the most important environmental laws that this country has ever seen by doubling funding for the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This is funding that provides resources to our national parks that are way underfunded, for example. It also provides funding for important programs in our inner cities, all by using revenues from offshore oil reserves. So this was a landmark law that was passed just this year, but no one's ever heard about it because it didn't have the controversy that usually animates the way that we govern in this country.
I do think, I think it's an astute observation you make, Sandra. That is to say that I think Congress has resorted increasingly over the last several years at using crises to resolve big questions. And I think we will test that theory going forward. And so one example is just building on Mike's point about the environmental demands of the country is query whether there's a bipartisan arrangement on climate that can get enacted, on new forms of energy, on some kind of accounting for the global cost of carbon pollution. And the way to ultimately to be able to do that, I do think that we need some return of the kind of muscle memory that Mike's talking about. That is to say, muscle memory of what it takes to get an agreement, greater participation from an increasing number of members who maybe have less experience with getting those kinds of agreements. But it just may be that we're in a period where for a while it is in fact crisis that pushes members to work together.
One of the things that happens day to day in terms of leadership and politics that I'm sure you know from your roles is the work of staffers. So the more behind the scenes leadership that you were both parts of. I wonder if you could talk about the contrast between this kind of brinkmanship within Congress and the work of the staffers day to day, getting the agreements through from your experience. I'll start with you, Dennis.
Yeah, well, thanks, Sandra. I kind of really learned about the importance of staff from one of the U of R staff members' dads. So Andrew Tillman, who works for Dr. Crutcher, his dad was longtime staffer for Senator Fulbright. And I got a chance to study with him at Georgetown University and learned a lot from him about the importance of expertise and getting to an arrangement. He worked in the Senate back in the day when there was nonpartisan committee staff. So every member of the staff staffed both Republicans and Democrats.
Right.
That quickly went away after Watergate, and all the crisis and confrontation that resulted from that very tumultuous period. But I think it underscores a really important lesson about staff, which is there are actually not just positions and postures, there's actually facts and results. And when you have experts in a room drawing on their experience, not only with understanding the legislative process, but also drawing on their expertise in particular areas, tax policy, environmental policy, energy policy, national security policy, that's where drawing on that expertise of staff, you kind of increase the operation space for potential agreement. And I think that's something that Mike and I have been able to witness over time, given our roles both in Congress but also in the administration, to see that from kind of both Article 1 of the Constitution and Article 2 of the Constitution.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with Dennis more. This staff, in my mind, really is the grease in the gears that make sure that the gears continue to function. So I think a lot of times the partisans, the principals, have to throw their swings throughout a political process. They have to do what they need to do to appease their caucuses or to appease voters on one side of the political spectrum. But staff is still working together to reach agreement. And I think what we understood is that there are going to be times when principals, meaning members of Congress or the President of the United States or the cabinet, that they have to say things that make our jobs a little bit harder. But we also understand that those are aspects of the partisan nature that we live in. But staff still is working to reach common ground to get things done. And I think one of the disappointing things at this point in our history is that staff salaries in the United States Congress continue to go down. And as a consequence of that, you have fewer and fewer people who want to join the ranks of congressional staff. But this is just like it is to serve your country in other ways. This is a way to serve your country. And we need to make sure that they're compensated appropriately to do the incredibly important work that is ahead of them.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I just pile on this last
Yes.
this last point about service? We were talking among us late last week and then during the course of the day today, and I just want to underscore something that I think generations of University of Richmond students have done, which is this federal service, whether it's in the military, intelligence, the diplomatic corps, the federal service, or in Capitol Hill. This whole exercise only works because the American people buy into it. And it only works because we get the expertise and the capacity that you spend and Dr. Crutcher spends so much time training. And so if I could leave one message with University of Richmond students, it's that Uncle Sam needs them, now more than ever, given the challenges we face and knowing the great education and opportunity they get here. I hope they consider going straight north to help us out in Washington.
So we're in the Jepson School of Leadership Studies, and the University of Richmond has, as part of its mission, that we're educating students to lead lives of purpose. One of the questions that we heard earlier today from a student was about whether one might feel discouraged. And so just as a follow-up to both of your remarks about this, how do we ensure that our students aren't discouraged about the political situation in which we live? What signs of hope can you offer us or offer them?
Well, I'd say this. I mean, the opportunity to, well, let me put it this way. There was a very senior Foreign Service officer. His name was Mark Grossman. He worked for President Bush, and then he came back into service for President Obama, where he served as the special representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. He told a story about young Foreign Service officers who would come to see him, discouraged about their next posting, for example, or unhappy with the politics of the current administration. And they'd say, I'm really thinking about leaving the Foreign Service. And he'd say, well, take a look around. This is when he's outside the government. He said, take a look around this room. And they'd look around. He'd say, the one thing you don't see in this office that you'll see in your office when you go back to the State Department is the flag.
Oh, sorry.
Is the flag of the United States of America.
Yes.
And he said, so the question you have to ask yourself before you leave is, what does it mean to you to be able to work in an office where you get to fly the flag of the United States of America? And that is something I've thought of a lot since I've left the government. It's a huge blessing. Not only that, as I said a minute ago, the whole experiment only works when we have the buy-in and the expertise of the American people. It's unique on the planet in that regard. And so all I can tell you is it is rewarding work. It is difficult work. It's sometimes not greatly remunerated. But I can also tell you that if I can join the cabinet of the President of the United States, if I can become the Deputy National Security Advisor or the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States, literally anybody can become the Chief of Staff of the President of the United States. And it's a great opportunity.
That's so inspiring. Mike?
I would absolutely echo that. I mean, I have, young staffers that I meet with frequently who repeat a similar story that, I've been here 3 or 4 years. It's time for me to move on. I'm ready to do something else. And I always encourage them to stay longer because I think the opportunity for young people in particular to make a difference in their government very early in their careers is incredible, particularly when you work in the United States Congress or in a White House. And you don't want to miss that opportunity. And I do think people oftentimes think, well, they're going to double my salary and I'm going to be able to do X. All of those people end up coming back to my office 5 years later and saying, boy, I want to go back to the Hill. Can you help me out? Because they haven't got the full experience that they needed to be successful in whatever they want to do next. So I think there are plenty of opportunities for people to succeed on a bipartisan basis, focusing on really that 90% of things that actually are happening in our government that are done on a bipartisan basis. And these crises will come and we'll solve those crises. And it might not always be pretty, but we need that expertise that is groomed at those very early ages to be there when those crises come, because they're going to come and we're going to have to solve those big problems.
So I want to go back to the actual work of bipartisanship. What can you tell us, what advice can you give us, or experiences can you recount about how you overcame political divides, both across parties but also within your own parties? I wonder if you could give us some examples of that. Maybe I'll go back to you, Mike.
Yeah,
Denis.
I mean, look, I served in government during a very divided time. This was a period where President Obama was president. Republicans controlled one house of our Congress and the House of Representatives. But there were a lot of expectations of the things that House Republicans could do, even though they were the majority in only one house in our government. And we were dealing with a very partisan time. A number of those people had been elected in the so-called Tea Party wave in 2010, based on promises that they probably couldn't keep because President Obama was still in office. One of the things that I'll say is there were a lot of things that we had to do to appease and to work with partisans on our side of the aisle. There were a lot of back-channel conversations going on between Denis and me, or the president and the speaker, about what each side had to do and what each side had to give throughout. And I think what was important about those conversations is that both sides knew the limits of what they could and could not do throughout. And as a consequence, they were able to give each other space. And even though one had to throw a partisan jab here, or the other had to throw a partisan jab there, there was still work going on because there was a mutual understanding of the importance of accomplishing big things. So I think as we talked about the importance of staff, and about it being the important grease in the gears to make sure things got done, I think we were able to demonstrate it in a lot of ways where we were able to get some things done in a very highly partisan way, but it's because there was mutual respect on both sides. And I think all of our leaders could learn a little bit from those kinds of experiences as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I would say, just building on Mike's good points, the easiest way to find places of shared interest is by listening. And so one of the things that I think when we worked together, thought was very important was to maintain an open line of communication. Not because we always agreed, but because we knew that we both had important understanding of a series of shared interests, and we had mutual respect. And so that will continue to have to be a fundamental part of any major challenge that the country faces. I'll give you 2 examples maybe of places where even at very difficult times we were able to make some breakthroughs that, where we actually found ways to cooperate on trade, for example, with Speaker Boehner or Speaker Ryan, where we could advance what was called trade promotion authority, so that we were being in a position to continue to try to use diplomacy to open markets for U.S. manufactured goods to be sold overseas. And we were able to do that even when we had some objection within our own party. It wasn't universal support for it in the Republican Party either. But by having an open line of communication, by listening, we could find that cooperation. Similarly, on something even like Cuba, that for more than 50 years has been basically a static policy, we were able to make a series of improvements that I would characterize as improvements in the policy, relying on cooperation with a series of Republican members of Congress and overcoming opposition, including from Democratic members of Congress. But again, we have to get back to the point where we're listening to one another and where we're recognizing that actually what we want out of these debates is not positioning or posturing. What we want is an outcome. And we want to be able to execute that outcome to advance the interests of the American people rather than to advance the interests of a particular party. And there's examples of that all the time. But let's be honest, it's increasingly difficult, right? And so this is why it's so important that you're doing what you're doing, both with this dialogue, but also with the students that you're training and educating. And this is why I really hope that they come to Washington. Because Uncle Sam needs them. They need more people to be able to do the kinds of things that I think Mike and I were able to do at various times.
I absolutely love the emphasis on listening and reading and learning and so on, as opposed to posturing. I think that's a really important distinction that we
I don't know, you must have had this conversation all the time, Mike, where somebody would tell you, well, look, let's figure out how we get the issue out of this debate.
Yeah.
And you're like, listen, man, we got a lot of issues. Let's get an outcome out of this debate.
You brought up trade, Dennis, which I think is such a great example. Trade has become, unfortunately, a really difficult issue for everyone at this point. At one point, there was a very strong bipartisan commitment to opening up free markets and free trade. Dennis mentioned trade promotion authority. I reflect on that. Usually trade bills are passed with what's called trade adjustment assistance, which is basically workforce training to those who are disadvantaged by opening up other markets. When we passed TPA, you may recall that it was also a bill that failed the first time in the House of Representatives. We didn't have the votes because Republicans left because they didn't like the establishment of a new welfare program, and Democrats didn't like trade promotion authority, even though they were trying to give it to a Democratic president. I remember walking into Speaker Boehner's office and saying, we're just going to take all the trade adjustment assistance off this bill, and we're going to pass this on a partisan basis. And just to get it over to the Senate to get this done, the Senate will re-add trade adjustment assistance. We just got to get the White House on board with this strategy. And were it not for relationships, pre-existing relationships with the White House to tell them what the play call was, that we're going to get TAA in, you just got to let us pass TPA first. Without it in there, we promise you it'll be in there in the end. But were it not for the give and take of that relationship that existed between us and the president's office, that never would have happened. We never would have gotten TPA done were it not for a dialogue that had continued throughout, again, a really difficult period.
Yeah, that's absolutely interesting. I'm Canadian. You may not know this, but I am. And NAFTA has always been something that just raised so many problems within Canada. I mean, people have such strong views, and really, yeah.
We know.
So we're now, facing some of the most difficult challenges that I've seen in my lifetime. Higher unemployment rates than I've ever seen, of course. Civil rights activism like we haven't seen since the late 60s. And of course, we're wearing face masks this evening because we're in the midst of a global pandemic. I wonder how you would advise Democrats and Republicans to work together to get some of these issues partly resolved in the future.
Well, look, I mean, we're in the midst of a pretty heated campaign. I think there's an open question as to whether there's going to be another assistance package in reaction to the ongoing pandemic.
Right.
But irrespective of whether, I think there should be, and I hope it includes assistance to the states and cities who have been so dramatically hit by the economic slowdown. But I also think next year, early next year, there'll be an opportunity. Look, I'll be candid, I hope it's with a new president. But in any case, there's going to be a start of a new Congress and a new administration, either a second Trump term or a first Biden term. And I hope we see some prioritization of a big package of assistance for infrastructure, for research and development, for investments in clean energy infrastructure, so as to underscore this opportunity for jobs and recovery coming out of the pandemic. And then there's obviously going to have to continue to be some set of pieces of that recovery package to ensure that we have assistance for universities and other training programs for workers who want to get onto career paths that include the kind of wage growth and mobility that has been frozen in this country for too long. So some focus on investments that allow workers of all ages to begin to see some credible wage growth, some affordable and accessible training programs. If we don't do that, it's going to be a big missed opportunity.
Yeah, look, I agree with Dennis. We don't know what the future is going to hold for a future COVID package. What I'd remind the audience is we've already had 3 COVID packages that have gone through Congress and have been signed into law by the President of the United States. So, at the beginning of this crisis, there was bipartisan agreement that we needed big trillion-dollar packages to deal with this terrible pandemic. We're now in the political silly season. And I think for some reason, both sides of the aisle think that they are advantaged by not getting a package done. I think it's very unlikely at this point that there's going to be another COVID-related relief package until either President Trump is re-sworn in or re-inaugurated, or Joe Biden takes the oath of office on January 20th. But you reach a point, in these political seasons where the train just becomes too heavy to pull. And we're probably at that point, particularly now that we're dealing with an unexpected Supreme Court, an unfortunate death at the Supreme Court with Ruth Bader Ginsburg. So I think it's unlikely that we're going to have that kind of package. But I do think at the beginning part of the next administration, there is going to be an opening to address some of those issues, and they will need to be addressed. I think Denis and I both agree that there's going to need to be more relief coming because of this severe economic strain. The contours of the package, I think we can probably disagree on, but again, there's common ground there. It's pretty easy to see what the agreement looks like today on a bipartisan basis.
I'm very glad you mentioned Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She was going to be the next topic that I brought up, so thank you. So as we all know, we lost a leading light in bipartisanship and the ability to speak civilly with one's ideological opponents. I wonder if you might comment briefly on your expectation for what will happen next in the court as we go forward through the next few weeks and then next months.
Well, I think that, as Mike has said, we're in kind of the height of the political season. Obviously, the path that Senator McConnell chose 4 years ago was to say, hey, let's take a little bit of a step back from where we are. And I think what he said at the time was, let the American people have a role in the selection of the next justice. That was his position then. He seems to have a different position now. My sense is, just to answer your question directly, what do I think will happen? I think unless cooler heads prevail, I think it looks like Senator McConnell will insist on filling the vacancy, which I think will only increase the partisan, polarized nature of debate in Washington of the type that we've been discussing. And I think that would be unfortunate. But judging from the reading of the newspaper since Friday night, it feels like that's likely. Look, I will say that Justice Ginsburg's, it's been as sad as it has been to witness her passing, to reread the stories of her remarkable life is just underscores once again that this whole enterprise only works because the American people invest in it and work at it the way she did in an absolutely remarkable way for her whole life. And so that's a great reminder, one. Two, you mentioned her friendship with Justice Scalia, which his son, the current Labor Secretary, wrote a very powerful op-ed in the Washington Post over the weekend about their unlikely friendship, which was based on this idea that they both learned from each other and they both listened to each other, as disputatious as some of their conversations were, which is another reminder. And so I hope we can get back to that recognition that we're all on the same team. We only succeed when we do this together. And that may require debates and disputes, but a recognition that we're all on the same team is part of what I worry will get harder out of a overly tumultuous path that we appear to be on the vacancy.
Yeah, look, Denis and I both have daughters, and it's something that we share of similar age. And I think all of us recognize the tremendous path that Ginsburg paved for our daughters in her jurisprudence. So I think all of us owe her a great debt of gratitude. What I will say is, I would go back a little bit further than his comment about Senator McConnell. You may recall that it used to take 60 votes to confirm judges. And I do think having that 60-vote hurdle in the United States Senate, led both sides of the aisle to ensure that when consideration of a new nominee for any court in the land, that you were somewhere within the 40-yard lines of American jurisprudence. And what I'd say is when Senator Harry Reid, who was majority leader at the time, decided instead to lower that threshold to 51, I would say that that was the real match that was lit in terms of, the current era that we find ourselves in how we nominate and select Supreme Court justices. In our history, there have been 27 vacancies in election years of Supreme Court justices, and every single time a president of the United States has nominated someone, it's up to the Senate at that point to advise and consent to those nominees. I suspect that the president, as he said, will nominate someone, and the Senate, because it is controlled of his party, will act. Let there be no doubt that if the shoes were on the other foot, the Democrats would be doing the exact same thing. And many times in politics, unfortunately, it's not where you stand, it's where you sit. And we're in that era right now. And I do think, we need to think about what are some of the things that we can put our swords down on, and we can come up with ways to get that bipartisanship back. Sometimes you let the genie out of the bottle, and it's just too hard. But I think that there would be utility in both sides at this point, thinking about what are the ways, what are the structures that we can put into place to bring some sense of bipartisanship back. Because as Senator McConnell said, when Senator Reid made that rules change, that you're going to regret this, and it's sooner than you think. And I think both sides probably at this point are ready to pull back. But as St. Augustine once said, "Lord, make me chaste, just not yet." And that's probably what Senate Republicans are thinking about right now.
So if you were to think about how we can get back to a more bipartisan world, whether it's institutional changes or structural changes, or whether it's having more people who are willing to be cooperative, so different kinds of politicians, people, what are your thoughts about how we can get back to, at least partway back, to a more bipartisan world?
Yeah, so I think the answer is to, I think there's no challenge facing Americans or America that is bigger than Americans or America. We got to let ourselves be ourselves again. So just to pick up on Mike's point, the Senate Majority Leader said his proudest moment was when he looked President Barack Obama in the eye and said, "You will not fill the seat created by by Justice Scalia's passing." And I remember reading that at the time, he said that's his single proudest moment as a leader. Imagine that. That's not Americans being Americans and drawing on our best selves. I can think of other things that he's done that are quite remarkable. And so I think our challenge is to stand back and say, hey, let's figure out how we have the debates. We have the transparent, candid, and open debates that allow us to learn from one another, rather than to turn off the debates or turn off the opportunities to test the ideas. And that's what we've done at every tough turn in this country's history. Relying on the institutions, trying to make them more perfect, recognizing as the founders did from the beginning, that it was an imperfect union, it needed to be perfected. I think that's the answer. And to rely on those kinds of experiences and attributes that have gotten us through difficult times in the past.
Thank you. Mike?
Yeah, I'd say, we're at a point in our history where because the American people are so divided, you're going to get a government that is divided. I think the American people have to make this decision as to, who we elect. And, are they going to represent, problem solvers in the middle, or are they going to represent, partisans on either side? And I think that's the big challenge for the American people. We get the government that we deserve. And I think if we can't figure that out, we're going to continue to have these partisan struggles going forward. But I do think that there are some things rules that we can put in place that could make things a little bit better. But this choose your news, partisanship, no matter what, culture in which we live makes that very difficult. By the way, it's not just happening in the United States.
Yes,
it's happening
of course.
throughout the world as well. And you can see this rise in partisanship, more division. It tracks the entire, almost completely with the rise of social media in particular.
Oh, interesting. So I'm not sure which way the causality goes, though. So, it may be that the people are divided in part because our politicians are divided. So that's a follow-up question that I have for you. And then for you, Dennis, it's a little too rosy. And so I'm just going to press you a little bit because it does seem to me that something has changed, right? So that we can't just rely on the institutions the way they are right now because some of the rules have changed to make things more partisan and so on. So I guess if you could each follow up on those short questions, small questions.
Yeah, I'm happy to start. When I first came to Capitol Hill, this was probably similar to Denis. There were very few voices that we, from a media perspective, that Republicans anyway, listened to. It was basically the Wall Street Journal editorial page. It was your at-home editorial page, and on the right it was talk radio. Now we have this proliferation of new media outlets. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. I mean, the more voices, that's what this democracy is really meant to foster. But I do think it has led to certain divisions within our politics as a consequence. And anybody with a webcam and a microphone can get attention. And the regular cultural structure around how that kind of information is put forward, have completely fallen apart. And I don't know how. Again, I don't know how you get that back. But the American people have to be part of this solution as well. If they want more bipartisan solutions, they need to elect people that are more committed to bipartisanship. So I think all of us would welcome that opportunity. Certainly those of us that relish opportunities to get in the game and try to solve big bipartisan problems.
Yeah, so I think I was maybe imprecise, Sandra, because my point isn't to let the institutions be the institutions. My point is to recognize the practices that made the institutions great in the past.
Got it.
And those practices are openness, transparency, willingness to take hard votes. Very rare that you see a vote taken in the Senate now that you don't know the outcome of the vote before they take it.
Exactly.
We still have a bunch of money that flows into campaigns, and we have no idea where it comes from. Those are two examples of us not relying on the practices and the capabilities that turned us into the vibrant democracy that we are. And just to build on Mike's point, so that's what I meant when I answered the question earlier.
Got it. Thank you.
Because look, the institutions themselves started from a very incorrect position, right? We counted a significant portion of our population as 3/5 of a human. There is no doubt that the union needed to be perfected in that, and we're continuing to perfect it. But just to build on Mike's point, when I became chief of staff, I called all the living chiefs of staff to ask them for their advice, and I called Jim Baker, who's, I think, kind of by acclaim understood to be the best, most effective chief of staff. And he said, he had a lot of good advice. One piece of his advice is he said, Dennis, at the end of every day, I called the news anchors to let them know what was on the president's mind. And on Friday afternoons, I called the Sunday show anchors to let them know what was on the president's mind, and then I was done for the day. And I said, Mr. Secretary, because he's also Secretary of State and Secretary of Treasury, I said, Mr. Secretary, I think it's a little different now. There's about 3 or 4 turns of the media cycle between supper time and the next morning. And between Friday night and Sunday morning on the Sunday shows, it's a different world. And I think Mike is correct that more voices is good, but more voices based in fact, more voices inclined to inform, more voices coming from transparent places that you can affirm and understand, rather than disinformation from Russian intelligence. Those are the kinds of things, not just the plethora of voices, which is in the main a good thing, but where those voices are coming and whether they're deliberately trying to divide us, and whether we're naming that, and as citizens choosing more carefully about what we read, I think will go a long way to get us to the kind of fact-based debate that will get us to fact-based outcomes.
You know, one other point that I would make in this space is I do think that a number of politicians now are actually very separated from the place that they're supposed to govern, which is to say that most of the money that is spent in this country is on autopilot through entitlement programs, whether it's Medicare, Medicaid, or Social Security. Members of Congress, 75% of the spending that happens in this country, they don't even vote on, in any way in their entire terms in the United States House of Representatives or the Senate, because it is on autopilot. So I do think it magnifies the issues that they actually are voting on, because they have such really little control over most of the spending that goes on in this country. So they're fighting over, really a pittance when it comes to the annual appropriations bills in particular. So what's that old line about college faculty, that the fights are so big because the issues the stakes are so low,
Yes. Yeah.
right? So I do think that it translates a little bit into Congress as well. I mean, our government has basically become an insurance company with a military. And as long as Congress is only fighting over a small pittance of the federal budget, and that's where we have to get into some budget reform issues as well, I think you're going to continue to see these big partisan fights on big issues. But I bet Denis and I could sit down and come up with 10 ways where these things could, where we could make things better. But unfortunately, we're just not in that point when Denis and I can sit down and do so.
So thinking about what has changed since you were in your roles as chiefs of staff, one thing might be then social media or more partisan media. Another might be less listening and so on happening, less transparency. Are there any other thoughts you would have about what's changed since you were in your roles?
Well, it's not that long ago. Notwithstanding the fact that my hair's now white. But I guess I just want I want to just double tap the social media issue, not because social media qua social media, but I think we do have to take a step back and understand for a second that foreign intelligence services trying to use the news sources that we consume to separate us this is a real live issue.
Yes.
And so I think that means that there's a real challenge on us as individuals in what we consume. This is what you spend a lot of time with your students talking about, which is you're considering your sources. How do you verify its accuracy? What do you accept as fact? What do you confirm as fact? So that's an issue for kind of where you get your news and all that. But so it's a question for editors to resolve. It's a question for TV news stations to resolve. It's a question for Facebook and Twitter. But it's also a question for each of us.
Right. Yes.
Which is what are you consuming and what are you believing and what are you posting and what are you forwarding and what are you associating your name with? My dad used to say, if you wouldn't write it and sign it, don't say it. Right? Think to yourself about what are the kinds of things that you like or that you post or that you forward or that, and you think about that, and I think if we're all a little more discerning and maybe start talking with our neighbors instead of posting on Facebook in a very impersonal way, we might be back to the kinds of things that have made us the envy of the world, rightly.
Thank you. Yeah. Mike?
Look, I completely agree with Dennis. I mean, I do think we have to check our sources here in particular. You know, we know that there are foreign entities that are funding many groups out there that are meant to divide us. And I do think, you know, checking sources and actually going to sources that we know are reliable, I think is going to be an important aspect for all of us to pursue. But I do think that I don't want people to be dismayed. There are a lot of incredible people in our government that are there for all of the right reasons to solve big problems. You know, there are a lot more Denis McDonoughs up there than people realize. Right. And, you know, I think there's cause for great hope. You know, this country is still the greatest country in the world, and the beacon for every other country in the world. Yes, we have our issues. Yes, we have our partisanship and our divisions. But I'm very optimistic about the future. And one of the reasons I'm optimistic is because of programs like the one here at the University of Richmond that are talking about these big issues.
I'm so glad to hear an optimistic note because we're getting toward the end of our time, so thank you. My mother would tell me that if it wasn't something that I would write and put on the front page of the Globe and Mail, then that, rather than signing it. So just a little Canadianism there. And Canada's pretty great too, I'll just say. But as we're wrapping up, I wonder if you could each give your wisdom and advice to our students who we hope will be going into public service in the future or just being part of this great democracy. I'll start with you, Dennis.
I'm happy to do it. I mean, to the students, I just say that you really have no idea the amazing things and the amazing people, the amazing things you'll get to do, the amazing people you'll get to meet. And the skills that they're taking from here, from working with you and your colleagues, from working with their student colleagues, you know, the sky is still the limit on what you can do in the United States of America.
Great.
And I hope part of what you choose is to go work for Uncle Sam because we need you. Uncle Sam needs you. And when you do, you get to meet really great people like Mike. And there's not a more optimistic thing, frankly, than that.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course, I agree with Dennis. And just to underscore this point, I have 3 kids that are either going to college or on their way to college. And one of the things that I emphasize to them is the importance of giving back in some way. You have to figure out a way, whether it's through serving in the military or serving your government in some other way or serving your community to give back. It is the most important thing that we do. I spent 20 years working for Congress. Most people wouldn't view that as public service, but trust me, the people who do it are the most committed patriots that you'd ever want to meet. Mm-hmm. I, of course, would never compare that service to the year and a half that my father spent in Vietnam, for example. But it was service, and we were giving back and we were serving our country. So I would say find a way to serve the world around you. There's plenty of time to go out and make a lot of money. But part of leadership to me is the importance of servant leadership and giving back to your community. And this country, which has given us all so much, is serving your country in whatever way you can.
Thanks so much.
Or serving Canada.
Well, secondarily.
Yeah.
I want to thank you so much for coming to the University of Richmond. You've been inspiring, and I'm sure you've given our students and our alumni and friends much to think about. And now it's my pleasure to invite Dr. Crutcher to close our program, but thank
Great.
you.
Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you again, Denis and Mike, for engaging in this important discussion with us this evening. And thank you, Dean Peart, for moderating. You've gotten off our season to a great start. I'd also like to thank everyone in the audience for tuning in this evening. The University of Richmond is grateful to share this learning opportunity with you, and we very much hope you will join us for future events. The next Sharp Series event for this year will take place on November the 11th, 2020 at 7 p.m. via live stream, featuring a conversation between Mary Kate Carey, former speechwriter for President George H.W. Bush, and Mary Ann Marsh, Democratic political analyst and consultant. Ms. Carey and Ms. Marsh will unpack with us the results of the 2020 elections. Please remember to vote on November the 3rd. Again, thank you for joining us. Good night.